Last time we were together, we discussed the work of Karl Marx, and we were using Karl Marx as an entry point into a perspective on the Industrial Revolution. And I'll come up again, or bring back. I'll summarize the main points that we discussed last time. But today what we're going to do is we're going to build on that discussion, and we're going to turn our attention to the work of Thorstein Veblen and his seminal work, The Theory of the Leisure Class, which you have several chapters of included in your reading pack. And we're going to go through the reading. Our goal is to go through the Veblen's text, and we're going to do it in a somewhat monastic way. I kind of like gather around children while I read you type of exercise, because Veblen's text is very interesting, but it's not easy to read until you get a sense of how to read him. So in order to assist you in getting into the text, we're actually literally going to read passages together and then figure out what he's trying to say. Normally, the purpose of writing is to communicate ideas clearly. That's what I'm expecting from you, for example, in your essays. But Thorstein Veblen does not live up to that standard. He seems to go out of his way to write needlessly complex sentences and use terms that sort of have a private meaning for him. So we need to uncover some of what that is. And if we do that, I think we'll find that his ideas are actually very interesting and very striking. Shall I turn the lights on? Can you hit the lights for me? Weird sitting here in the dark. There we go. That looks good. Whoa, that's too bright. Is it? Can we adjust it? I don't know. I think it's... There we go. Okay, that's perfect. No, that's excellent. So that's the plan. We'll take a break, of course, as we always do, and if we can get through the material in a live fashion, we'll be able to get out of here hopefully a little bit early. In any event, let me remind you what we're doing here in Module 4. So we've moved into this modern era, right? We've placed the notion of the market into a kind of critical perspective, and we've scrutinized the concept of the market in various ways. We've seen that markets can exist in multiple forms and do all kinds of different work depending on the social setting and the historical setting when we find them. So there's no such thing as a single market. Market is a human institution that serves multiple human ends. So we saw, for example, in the case of the cooler ring, there was a market that was quite elaborate, built around the exchange of just two commodities that had seemingly little utilitarian value. But the underlying purpose of that entire market system, that system of exchange, was to elaborate and maintain social rules, codified hierarchies, and negotiate the terms of social relations inside of Trobriander society. And we saw that the underlying utility, at least as being suggested by a number of anthropologists, was in order to alleviate those societies from the constant warfare or conflict that otherwise typically characterizes Polynesian society. So the market, in this case, served a utilitarian social need to allow people to live in greater peace than otherwise would be the case. So it's not until the 18th century that we start to see the emergence of a market that we would recognize as the market that surrounds us. And the last time we were together, we identified the work of Polanyi, the term that Polanyi uses, the notion of a great transformation to describe the emergence of this market in the 18th century. And the transformation that Polanyi points to is the so-called disembedding of the market from inside of society. So unlike the example of the cooler ring, where the market is embedded as a function of social utility, this now changes, and instead of being subordinate to the society, now it becomes above the society, right? So we live below the market. And what that means, as we mentioned last time, is that all of us lead lives that are necessarily determined by the market conditions that surround us, right? That's in fact, the very lives that we can conceive of leading are themselves determined by the nature of that market. As I mentioned last time, institutions such as this one, in fact, the very existence of university-level education, wherever you find it, not just here, but all across the globe, links very much to this notion of a market function. Because for most people, for the large majority of people, the fundamental utility of attaining a university education is to increase the value of your own human capital And that means then when you go into the job market to exchange the labor that you represent for a wage that someone's willing to give you, that because you've invested in your own human capital, the value of your work will be higher than if you had not, right? So it's strange, but it's a good example of what Polanyi's talking about, because that means that the whole strategy of knowledge acquisition that you're engaged in here actively and will be for the next several years is entirely driven by a market logic. You're not here for the simple or abstract love of learning or to solve some great metaphysical problem of the universe. You're here literally so you can get a better job. And that's the kind of encompassing logic that surrounds us. But it's not just in terms of the way that we educate ourselves, the way that we see our lives unfolding. I'd like to live in a certain house and drive a certain car with certain goods, etc. All of that is being driven by a kind of market logic. And it sounds a bit depressing when you put it this way, because what it means is that all of us can be reduced essentially to some kind of market agent. But that's what Polanyi wants to talk about when he says that there's been this great transformation, the disembedding of the market from society. So another way of thinking about that is we don't control markets. Markets control us. They dominate our thinking. And we then used not Polanyi, but Karl Marx to explore in its details what this looked like. And so the last time we were together, we went through Marx's analysis. And the reason why Marx is such an interesting figure to elucidate this particular phenomenon, the sort of the emergence of the market in its more or less modern form, is because not only was Marx a witness to this history that was unfolding, but as I mentioned last time, he understood what it meant to be a witness to history. So he wasn't a passive witness. He himself was seized with a sense of urgency and even enthusiasm about the way in which history could be observed unfolding before him. And the idea there is that if you can understand the history that is happening to you, you can then become an agent in your own history. So instead of something that simply belongs to the past, if you understand what's happening around you, then you have the power to be able to change it. And I think that explains a lot of what we find inside of the Communist Manifesto, which is the text that commands our attention in this class. It's not a call to action. I mean, it is in part. But it's also an attempt to explain to readers, this is what's happening, and this is how you can situate yourself inside of them. Good morning, how are you? Good morning. So we looked at the Communist Manifesto, we looked at the terms that Marx lays out, and we saw that inside of that text, Marx provides us with a historical reckoning, a historical analysis that places at the very center of the system that he's seeing unfold the important, what he calls, revolutionary role of the industrial bourgeoisie, the people who have, as it were, invented this new modern industrial-based economy. And the importance of the bourgeoisie from Marx's perspective was they had taken the animating feature that has always existed inside of human society, namely the existence of class and class struggle or class exploitation, class-based exploitation, that they'd taken that and had made it visible. So it wasn't as if they invented it. There had always been class struggle and class-based differences. But what the bourgeoisie did was, in his words, they simplified it. So that is to say that you, in this sort of new chapter of human history, you would be able to recognize yourself as part of a class, which from Marx's perspective was new, because prior to that period, you would not have been able to situate yourself as a class or as a member of a certain class. You would have seen yourself, depending on where you were in life, through some kind of complex arrangement of social and probably to some degree for many people divine arrangements, right? God made the world in a certain way and there you are. So the bourgeoisie, or the rise of this new industrial economy, has simplified very significantly the overall dynamic of human relations. And you may recall that in the Marxist perspective, there's only two classes of people. Three if we count peasants, but Marx doesn't consider them a class. Good morning. The first class are the people who have to work for a living. Anybody who has to go out every day, exchange their labor for a wage, that's how they put food on the table. Those are the proletarians. And the other class, the bourgeoisie, people who live off the rents, or who live off the surplus value that the labor of the proletariat is able to create, right? But we'll say living off of rents. So if your day looks like you getting up in the morning, putting on your nice work clothes and going out and exchanging your labor for a wage using the labor market, you're a proletarian. And if on the other hand you're sitting back and letting the rent checks flow in, then you're industrial bourgeois. Those are the only two categories that exist. And we observe that inside of Marx's reckoning of how the capitalist mode of production works, he identifies this concept, which I would call a theory of innovation, which is that once you've introduced the principle of market competition, if you want to be a successful firm operating in that system of competition, you constantly have to be thinking about how to introduce improvement to the way that you do business, right? To the way that you produce your products, find your customers, etc. So what he calls revolutionizing the means of production. But it's essentially a theory of innovation. So when we decide, for example, to start replacing various functions inside the firm with artificial intelligence, that's revolutionizing the means of production, just as much as it was in Marx's day, moving away from manually operated looms to power looms, which therefore meant the number of workers you needed inside of your factory was much smaller. And the process then that Marx identifies in conjunction with this theory of innovation, this constant revolutionizing of the means of production, is that it places into it creates an inevitable tension between the people who are providing the labor, or in Marx's terminology, the people who are being exploited, and the amount of remuneration for that exploitation or for that labor that they are then receiving, right? Because the goal or motivation of any firm, any organization that's operating inside of a competitive market is to keep its costs as low as possible. That's the only way it can remain competitive. A firm that can't keep its costs as low as possible will simply be placed out of business. So it's not a question of, there's no moral question here. It's not a question of moral goods. This is just how markets work. Firms don't want to overpay their workers. They want to pay them as little as possible. And ideally, we saw this, Marx lays this out, ideally the perfect wage to pay your workforce is just enough to keep themselves alive and reproduce for workers for the next generation, right? So you don't want to see, for example, a savings rate. A savings rate indicates inefficiency. If I'm paying you enough money so that at the end of every month you have a little bit to set aside, put away to do something, I'm paying you too much. Or theoretically, I could be paying you too much. Somebody could pay you even less and thereby make the same things I'm making at a lower cost and therefore outcompete me. So there's this, in other words, built-in mechanism inside of the capitalist mode of production, which is constantly going to be placing a downward pressure on wages, right? That's simply the that's simply the nature of the scheme. And highly paid labor that can be exchanged for a high wage, that as part of the revolutionizing of the means of production, competitive firms will always be looking to replace that kind of labor. So in our own day and age, or in the modern period, for example, we can explain the phenomena of globalization very simply by simply recourse to the Marxist framework. Why does it make sense not to produce cars in France or in Spain, but instead to produce them in China or someplace like that? The answer is, if I can get the same quality vehicle using a workforce that requires a much lower wage, then I'm incentivized to do that. At the moment, it's interesting when we look at things like the construction of automobiles, it turns out that at least for some automobiles, the quality or the nature of labor that is needed means it's not easy or not that easy to shift production entirely to low-cost jurisdictions. But when it comes to basic goods like, for example, apparel, almost all the world's apparel is now made in low-cost jurisdictions. It just makes sense to manufacture your apparel in places where the cost of labor is much lower. And so when a company closes its manufacturing center in, say, Europe and opens it in somewhere, say, in Southeast Asia, they're not engaging, it's not a moral action, right? This is not some question of their civic responsibility. It's simply a necessity introduced by the nature of the market. Trying to make T-shirts using high-cost labor in the West will lead to your competitive elimination if you don't then follow suit. A good example of that, do you know the name Dyson? Is that a name familiar to you? Dyson, they make vacuum cleaners. The guy who owns it is a fellow named James Dyson. He's a British engineer. I think he was ennobled, or maybe he was given I think he was given a knighthood. Anyway, for years, this guy Dyson would go around giving talks about how serious countries have to have a vital manufacturing base. If you don't make anything, you're not a real country, was basically his argument. And he was looking at this process of globalization, which is essentially the transfer of manufacturing jobs out of high-cost into low-cost labor jurisdictions, with a great deal of anxiety and concern, because he saw essentially what was happening was that the vitality, the underlying economic vitality of the countries so affected was being was being undermined by this transfer, essentially, of manufacturing know-how and expertise from north to south, from west to east, etc. Except that about, I can't remember when it was, I think it was in 2012 or something, he himself took his entire manufacturing facility, which had previously been based in the United Kingdom, and moved it to Malaysia. Because ultimately, he had to, in order to respond to competitive forces, he had to find himself a low-cost jurisdiction. So the purpose here is to simply demonstrate that even someone like James Dyson, who had made an entire career and received a knighthood based on services to the British manufacturing sector and repeatedly insisted that a vibrant manufacturing sector was necessary for the economic life of any country, even he had to then take his own manufacturing and move it to a low-cost jurisdiction as part of this, as part of the sort of necessity for survival in a competitive landscape. So what this means essentially for Marx, as we saw at the end, right, is that somebody working under this system is therefore going to be subjected constantly to a pressure on the amount of wage that they can receive for the labor that they can exchange. And if the labor market is a free market, right, meaning that we have free market forces that determine the equilibrium price for how much labor is worth. If it's a free market, what that means is that there's going to be no constraint on how low those wages can go, except some basic subsistence, right? People will not work for a wage that simply doesn't allow them to keep themselves alive, although maybe they will. But what it essentially means is then, as a function of, or as a result of this process of industrialization, that people moved out of the countryside, where they had, the vast majority of them, led more or less subsistence lives as peasants, into the cities where they were taking up these manufacturing and other type jobs. But because of the nature of the free market of labor, eventually they would be placed back into subsistence, right? That the free market for labor would eventually erode their capacity to exchange labor for a wage, and the wage they would receive would be as low as possible, right? Back to some sort of subsistence level. But there's an enormous difference, and this is what Marx identifies in that second part of the Communist Manifesto, is that once people have moved away from the rural setting into an urban setting, and they've been subjected then to this kind of system in which they are forced, in order to survive, to go look for a job, exchange their labor for a wage, that as part of that, they acquire a consciousness of their exploitation, right? This is the great achievement of the bourgeoisie. It's not only that they have ruptured the underlying economic modes of production, is that ultimately they have succeeded in creating the historical force that will drive humanity forward. And that force is the proletariat, or more accurately, the proletariat consciousness, the awareness that this system is set up to exploit you. People who are being then systematically exploited and know that they are being systematically exploited, what will they do? They will not simply passively accept being treated in this way. Instead, they will demand political change. They will demand some kind of underlying shift in how they are being treated. And this, in Marx's scheme, will lead to a new paradigm, right? A new way of humanity organizing its affairs. And the Marxist idealism kicks in. The chief characteristic of this new paradigm will be the elimination of that very element that creates exploitation, namely class difference. So we started our last class by looking at those 10 points that he raises at the end of the Communist Manifesto, and saying, if what you think of Marx are these 10 points, the elimination of private property, of inheritance tax, etc., all of those, nationalization of industry, all those things that we saw, that we're not really understanding Marx. Those 10 points that are being issued are not really a call for revolution, as much as they are a way to explain or how to guide what this change that is coming how it should look, right? But the point about it, for Marx at least, is the change is inevitable. People who understand that they are being exploited will change the system. Just as the human body reacts to avoid pain, so similarly the social body will also react to avoid the pain that's inflicted by systemic exploitation. So it's not like we need Marx to create revolution. We need Marx instead, or Marx, I think, saw himself as someone who could explain why it's going to happen and how to guide it, so that on the other side of the revolution, we can reach the kind of society that we want. And that society, fundamentally, recall, was not characterized by social or economic justice or equality, although those are features of the communist agenda, but fundamentally to grant to the individual her ability to self-actualize, to be the person that she is supposed to be. Was she really destined to go out and work for 40 years, trudging every day, wasting her humanity, working at a bank? Or is there, in fact, something inside of her that she was supposed to be doing differently, right? That's the kind of idea. That the work that she performs should not be the central feature of her life, simply to keep herself alive, but instead that she was destined for, all human beings are destined for other things, right? We are more than the mere drudgery of the work that we provide. Sorry, is your hand up? Yeah.
So, I don't know, the way I get it is that Marx believes that in any free market, like, if it continues for long enough, it will end in like a classless society. At least that's his theory.
Yes, that's right. Because a free market creates exploitation, and people will reject being exploited. That's exactly correct. Yes, and I think the other point that you make is also worth underlining. It's an inevitable change, right? It's an inevitable change. So we have then this perspective that comes to us from Marx. And the interesting thing, and this is why I used the Marxist text and not Polanyi, he's writing in the 1840s as this is happening. And in the 1840s, there were almost no protections for workers. Workers had no rights, and we typically think of worker rights. There were no rights, essentially, in the 1840s. There was no, for example, age restriction on who could work. So if you were 3 years old or 4 years old, off you went. In fact, it was, as you probably know, quite common to use small children to do chimney sweeping because they could fit down the chimneys. So young children of the working poor were often put to work cleaning chimneys. But there were many other jobs, I should note, that were also taken care of by children. There was no limit on how many hours you could work, right? So you could be putting in 16 or 17-hour days. In fact, 16-hour days was not terribly common, but 12-hour days was very common, to work 12 hours. Can you imagine working from 8 in the morning to 8 in the evening for a pittance wage? There was no such thing as weekends or time off or pensions or anything like this, right? It was simply a kind of naked system. You provide your labor, you get a wage, and that's the way it works. So writing in the 1840s in this environment, looking at the way in which this sort of pattern of exploitation is taking shape, for Marx it was self-evident, right? History is happening, that the consciousness of the proletarian is gaining as more and more people get swept up into this system, and eventually the proletarian will be the leaders of this change, the leaders of the revolution, the workers' rebellion, because they're the ones who have the consciousness of exploitation, and then there will be this better world on the other side, a different kind of paradigm. Not a paradigm where people don't work, but a paradigm where people are not alienated from their labor in the way that they are under the system. And I'm not going to get into that part because we've already covered in our discussion on capital how Marx explains that the worker is alienated from her labor right as the social relations in production disappear and are replaced instead by the commodity exchange and price. So we've already looked into that mechanism. So the question that we had when we left last time was, insofar as I think we can agree that people who feel exploited will indeed rise up and demand change inside of the system, why has the system not changed, right? Marx, obviously, even if his analysis in many respects is quite accurate, the question that we have is why did his prediction, why did his feeling that this system would inevitably change, why did that not come to pass? And obviously, insofar as he's locating this pattern or this drive for change inside of a social psychology, one of the ways we should probably answer the question is to interrogate what happened to the social psychology that this system creates. And another way to think about that is, does your average proletarian, I'm a proletarian, you will all be proletarians, right? Your parents were probably, most of them, proletarians. Do they see themselves as proletarians? Meaning, do they have that consciousness of being exploited as a result of exchanging their labor for a wage? And the answer is almost certainly not. They may not like their job that much, but that idea of naked exploitation, of producing something, working for the man, right? A lot of us don't feel that way anymore. Part of this is as a result of a process that Polanyi in his text identifies, which is when the excesses of the free market got so bad, one of the things we find is that we do organize ourselves politically in order to introduce important economic change, which is why There is no place in the West where we have anything like a free market, right? We tried free markets and they don't work. Free markets lead to low wages and 12-hour working days and 3-year-olds cleaning your chimney. So none of us accepts the idea that we want to live according to a free market. Instead, we have highly regulated markets which permit certain amounts of free exchange. But we, for example, insist that you have to be a certain age before you're allowed to work. We've introduced some of the things that Marx wanted, like universal education. We also have restrictions on the kinds of work you can do, of how much wage you get paid, and the kinds of benefits that attach as a result of that work, right? So all of us, for example, are entitled through paying our taxes to things like national health care and pensions and all the rest of it, right? So we're not expected to work 12-hour days for low wages for the entire rest of our lives merely to secure our existence. And that obviously has gone a long way to alleviating the sense of being exploited. Another function, of course, is that work itself has changed. So whereas Marx saw people who were going down the mine or else working at the loom or other sort of types of tedious, repetitive manufacturing jobs, at least in the West, the Western societies where Marx identified as being the sort of spearhead of this new paradigm, that the kind of work that we perform for many of us is more interesting than that kind of drudge manufacturing work. And in fact, the most tedious work can often now be performed by machines, so that people don't have to do it, right? So that's obviously had an impact as well. But I think the most important impact, right, takes place at a different level, which is that Marx recognized his key insight, I think, or one of the key insights of the Communist Manifesto, was he recognized that innovation is baked into the capitalist mode of production. It can't escape it. In fact, not only that, the capitalist mode of production systematizes the need for innovation, right? This is the Marxist insight that we see him identifying back in the 1840s. Yeah?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
The key insight of Marx is that the capitalist system bakes in or systematizes the need for innovation, right? You always have to be thinking about how to do things differently, how to do things better, because if you don't, your competitor will. And so therefore, as part of this, but he doesn't call it innovation, he calls it the constant revolutionizing of the means of production, but we would recognize that as innovation. And indeed, we'll turn our attention later in this module to the work of Joseph Schumpeter, who took this Marxist idea and used it, in fact, to explain why, from the Schumpeterian perspective, Marx's reading of capitalism was fundamentally wrong. Although I should note that Schumpeter also thinks, like Marx, that capitalism can't survive because of what it does, but he has a different basis for doing that. In any event, before we get to that also erroneous postmortem of capitalism, we'll stick with our existing discussion. So the point about it is that even though Marx identified innovation as being at the heart of capitalism, he assumed that the innovation was limited to the modes of production or to the means of production, right? Faster looms, more powerful equipment, right? All of that kind of stuff. He failed, I think, to recognize that the innovation that capitalism creates also operates at the level of society, right? Capitalism has innovated society. I don't know if I can say that, if that's grammatically correct. Does it sound right? Capitalism has innovated, or maybe we should say has innovated upon society. This is why, to explain a little bit what I mean, this is why when your great-grandparents, who I'm guessing would have, or maybe say great-great-grandparents who would have lived in, say, the mid-19th century, something like that, if you were to talk to them, if you could imagine somehow an environment where you got to have a conversation with your great-grandparents, your great-great-grandparents, the perspective on life that you would share with your ancestors could hardly be more different. Could hardly be more different. And that's not just a function of what's familiar to you in terms of what's around you, but your whole sense, for example, of time and space would be fundamentally different. Your sense of your expectations for your future would be fundamentally different. So it'd be hard for you to find much common ground. Whereas, if your great-great-grandparents replicated that experiment with their great-great-grandparents, it's highly likely that they would have understood more or less the conditions of life that each of them represented, right? So, in other words, part of the innovation upon society has been this notion of an expectation for change, the pace of change, right, that we now come to identify in our modern system. That next year will be better than this year, that a decade from now won't look like a decade before, etc. Right? All of that sort of idea. So that notion then that society itself is a field upon which this kind of innovation is happening, I think is something that eluded Marx because it went beyond his sort of mechanical analysis of what capitalism represents. And I think the key, or at least as I will identify it for the purposes of the argument that we're making in this class, the key shift that takes place somewhere between the time that Marx is writing and sometime to after the Great Depression, linked to the various reforms that we see introduced in terms of establishing worker rights and unionization, all the other things. But the key shift that takes place is that many people operating inside of Western societies psychologically stop seeing themselves as producers, going in every day, exchanging labor for a wage in order to produce, and instead start to see themselves as consumers. Same thing, going in every day, exchanging their labor for a wage, but not in order to produce, but instead in order to consume. That's the purpose of working, is to satisfy your identity as a consumer. You work not to produce for the man, instead you work to consume for yourself. And that, as it were, domesticates the function of your work, right, or the perspective that you have about the work that you're doing, away from a relationship that's characterized by exploitation, and instead it brings it back to your own self-interest, right? I work in order that I may consume, right, at this fundamental level. We'll be tracking that idea when we turn to the work of Kenneth Galbraith, whose argument in The Affluent Society is that an expression of affluence is found in the nature of consumption. All of us today, and our parents, all were brought up inside of this paradigm of consumption. You probably have to go back 2 or 3 generations, or maybe at least 2, to find people who might still have thought of themselves more as producers rather than consumers. It is undeniable today that all of us see ourselves as consumers. And the last reading that we're going to turn to in the module that we're in will be this idea of consumer debt or consumer credit. But to tease the discussion, you can think for yourself right now that a lot of the expectations that you have for yourself in your life, for example, to own a car, own a house, first of all, how much of your identity is going to be built around that, owning something, being an owner? And secondly, how nice the capitalist system has operated to make that possible to you by giving you the credit vehicles necessary that you may buy things that otherwise you would not be able to afford. That's a revolution, not in production, but a revolution in consumption. So this, I think, is what Marx failed to foresee, that in other words, the fundamental class-based dissatisfactions with the capitalist mode of production could be alleviated by making the people who are inside of that mode of production not stop seeing themselves as producers and instead see themselves as consumers. And that's a shift that takes place in the West, at least, sometime in the late 19th and particularly in the early 20th century. And we're all part of that, right? We are all now part of this consumer paradigm. It's a new paradigm. It's just not the paradigm that Marx foresaw. We still, all of us, pretty much have to go out and exchange our labor for a wage. We're all stuck inside of a proletarian environment in which the only way we have to keep ourselves alive is through the exchange of our labor for a wage, dependent on the market then in order to give us the wage. But instead of seeing that through the lens of exploitation, now we see it through the lens of consumption. And that's been an epochal shift in terms of how we then place ourselves inside of this system. This is why we're not, I think, grabbing the pitchforks and rushing out to demand change. Although you can see there are moments when people are getting pissed off, right? And increasingly, I think it's happening with greater frequency as we see certain sort of examples of popular discontent and the like. But what that's meant, and this is why I mentioned this last time, is that you may recall I pointed out that if Marx were somehow mysteriously to walk through this door into a classroom in which his thought is being taught, and you were to tell him, by the way, 170 years after you wrote the Communist Manifesto, and by the way, we have democracies featuring universal suffrage in which men and women can vote regardless of how much money they make, which was not the case in Marx's day. And yet, despite having this extraordinary amount of political freedom, we're still more or less operating under the capitalist mode of production that you described 107 years ago, he would be astonished, right? He'd be like, what the fuck are you people doing? How is this possible that despite your political freedom, you're still operating under the system? And the answer is, of course, because we don't feel it as an exploitative system. And so therefore we don't, and as a result, we're willing to have enormous amounts of wealth inequality. We have a few individuals who control hundreds of billions or 100 billion plus dollars, right? Extraordinary inequality inside of our society. It's okay. It has not created the kind of revolutionary conditions that Marx, I think, 107 years ago would have predicted as an inevitable outcome of that kind of wealth arrangement in our society. So this is the broad idea, that we have become not producers but consumers at a psychological level. Of course, we still produce, but the mindset that we bring is one of consumption. This is where Veblen's text, The Theory of the Leisure Class, kicks in. So what I'd like to do is I want us to turn our attention to this text and read together some of the ideas that he presents us with. Okay, we're going to take a little break. So back in just a couple, guys.